Over the past couple of decades, the music industry has undergone significant changes. These changes have been largely driven by the rise of music streaming services. Platforms like Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube have dominated the music industry. They have changed how music is distributed, consumed, and produced. This presentation will examine how new streaming services have affected revenue models, artist discovery, consumers, and more. Before the 2000s and before any streaming services came about, the music industry relied almost solely on the sale of vinyl records, cassette tapes, and CDs. The Octave blog says that the 1970s witnessed a golden age for vinyl records. However, after the 70s, cassette tapes became the biggest seller, which was then surpassed by CDs. But regardless of the format, most music was produced and sold on albums. Usually you cannot buy a song without buying the whole album. You had Tower Records and Virgin Megastore, who were some of the biggest retailers of these items of the time. They sold all sorts of music. At this time, artists would make most of their money from album sales and concerts. Aside from physical product, MTV and radio airplay were huge throughout the 80s and 90s. People listened to the radio all the time and heard new music on there. Songs would get popular from the radio and become MTV hits. Everyone would watch MTV. It was one of the biggest things out there. But this all changed once the 2000s arrived. The early 2000s, as well as the late 1900s, brought about a lot of digital piracy with the arrival of digital content and MP3 players. One of the first digital music sharing platforms, called Napster, was launched. It was cool at first, but it did not take long before it was taken advantage of. An article from ISP Planet says that system administrators reported that Napster accounted for 40 to 61% of their network's overall traffic. This traffic was the result of illegal MP3 file sharing taken off of Napster. According to CNN Money, US music sales and licensing started a steady decline in 1999. Record labels and others saw this huge drop and knew that something needed to be done. This brought about the arrival of legal streaming services. iTunes was the first big legal streaming service to pop up in 2001. It started as just a music player for Apple's iPod MP3 player. It could store up to 1,000 songs. That alone transformed the world of digital music. In 2003, the iTunes Music Store was launched. You could purchase songs on there for only 99 cents. This turned out to be a functioning business model for all those involved. There were still online piracy services, but they were so bogged down with viruses and malware that people began flocking to iTunes to download their music. This resulted in decreased revenues for record labels and artists. Many record labels were unhappy with Apple's CEO Steve Jobs' decision on the pricing of songs. Now people could pick and choose those songs they wanted to listen to without having to purchase an entire album. This is what began the shift away from artists releasing whole albums and instead putting out singles. Listening to music was becoming even more convenient for consumers. People started to discover music every day because of the ease of access. The music news blog Toxagon said that streaming platforms have made it easier for everyone to discover new genres and artists from around the world. The consumers were not the only people that were happy with this new ease of access. With iTunes, any artist out there with an iTunes account could publish their music publicly for the whole world to see. This was the start of the come up of smaller musicians. Being able to publish your music without a record label was a start of creating your own career. Even though artists and record labels were unhappy with the way that their music was being purchased, it really only affected the huge artists that put out records all the time. Consumers and so many smaller artists loved this new platform. The music listening and buying experience was becoming more and more tailored to the consumer. Listening to singles and playlists were starting to become more popular than listening to whole albums. This trend was solidified when Pandora Music was released in 2005. Now you can listen to playlists and radio stations that were personalized to your music tastes. They took your previous music streaming information and used it to create tailored radio stations. These playlists and radio stations would pull single songs off albums, which further drove people away from listening to whole albums. Now, even though platforms like iTunes and Pandora were gaining widespread popularity, CDs were still the biggest seller according to the Recording Industry Association of America. Revenues from CDs accounted for 85.6% of all revenue generated in the recorded music industry in the US for 2005. This was just about as high as it's ever been. At this point, cassette tapes had disappeared and vinyls were barely being sold. Vinyls wouldn't gain a bit of popularity back until the late 2010s and early 2020s. Around this time as well, Downloaded music, which was mainly from iTunes, only represented about 3 to 5% of total revenues. But the next few years brought about pretty big changes. In the period between 2000 and 2010, recorded music revenues in the US decreased by about 50%. Downloaded music was at an all-time high, coming in at about 40% of the total revenue generated per year. CD revenue had been halved, and subscription services were on the rise. Spotify released in 2008 but did not gain popularity until the mid-2010s. That's when subscription streaming services began to blow up. CD revenues and vinyl revenues pretty much disappeared, and streaming revenues went from about 20% to around 90% in about a decade. Apple Music helped this growth when it launched in 2015. Not only did streaming revenues increase, but so did overall recorded music revenues. Between 2015 and 2024, the total yearly revenues of the recorded music industry more than doubled. What does this mean? Well, so many more people were putting music out on platforms like Apple Music and Spotify. Tens of thousands of random artists and bands had the ability to get their music out there. Social media platforms like YouTube and Instagram made advertising your music possible without an expensive and controlling record deal. The music industry saw a general increase in music output. The increase came about from ease of access. As I said before, so many smaller artists could put out music on their own. But record labels also saw this. It was much easier for them to put out music on subscription platforms as well. Subscription platforms brought about a new way of listening. Streaming services were and still are always pushing new music. They always have new song suggestions and artist suggestions. Not only that, but since streaming services pay only a fraction of a penny to labels and artists, the labels saw that it was best to put out as much music as possible. They focused on finding new artists and releasing a ton of singles and EPs. Subscription services, along with social media, also brought about the rise of singer-songwriters. Not only were they really starting the trend on social media, but they worked great with the label's goals of putting out more music. Recording and successfully promoting a single artist was a lot easier than doing so for a band. Singer-songwriters started dominating the music industry. Pop stars like Justin Timberlake, Beyonce, and Katy Perry started blowing up. Now, even though artists and bands were able to put out more music, this did not mean that they were swimming in revenues from streaming services. Rather, this meant that they needed to tour, sell merchandise, and do commercials and advertisements to continue to thrive. As I stated before, services like Spotify and Apple Music were paying as little as 0.003 cents per stream. Wow. This combined with the fact that vinyls were only just starting to come back as a cool vintage memory of the past meant that artists and labels needed to expand and evolve. So, to summarize this presentation, today streaming services are used by millions every day. The RIAA shows that they bring in around 90% of all recorded music industry revenues. Every other revenue type has been blown out of the water, and with the way technology is ever advancing, digital subscription services will probably always be on top until something even better is introduced. It makes logical sense because these services are extremely tailored to the consumer. And where do record labels and artists get their money from? Consumers. Today, artists are putting out more music than ever. The release of singles was not something that was done before, but now it is done all the time. Since revenues from CDs and vinyls are not coming in anymore, artists have had to tour more often and sell merchandise and do advertisement and endorsement deals. Revenues no longer come from the purchasing of music, but rather the experience economy.